Zuri had grown up the eldest of 4 children in a modest household, where her mother sold vegetables at a roadside stand, and her father worked long, exhausting hours as a mechanic. And from an early age, she had learned that dignity was not something bestowed by circumstance, but something a person carried within themselves, regardless of how little the world offered them in return. She had worked her way through secretarial college, on a combination of scholarships and evening shifts at a small printing shop. Arriving at Kofi's company 5 years earlier as a junior assistant, before steadily proving herself indispensable enough to earn the position of executive secretary, a role she carried out with a quiet competence that many in the office had come to depend on more than they openly admitted. She had never once used her proximity to the company's leadership to seek favors or advantages, a restraint that Madame Zikora, during her occasional visits to the office, had noticed and quietly admired long before the elaborate scheme involving Vanessa had ever taken shape in her mind. Zuri had worked as executive secretary to Kofi, one of the country's most successful young business magnates, for nearly 3 years before the day his mother walked into the office and asked her to become part of a plan far stranger than anything listed in her job description. Madame Zikora, the matriarch of the family, and the quiet force behind much of the fortune her son now managed, had never been a woman who trusted appearances easily, and something about her son's fiancée, a striking, endlessly polished woman named Vanessa, had unsettled her from the very first introduction. Vanessa had entered Kofi's life 8 months earlier at a charity gala, arriving on the arm of a business associate, before skillfully redirecting her attention toward Kofi himself within the first hour of the evening, a pattern of calculated pursuit that Kofi, flattered and increasingly lonely after years of prioritizing work over romance, had never paused to examine closely. She came from a family of modest but respectable means that had, over the previous decade, invested heavily in appearances rather than substance, borrowing against an increasingly precarious fortune to maintain the lifestyle Vanessa had grown to believe was her birthright, a precariousness she guarded carefully from Kofi and his family, presenting instead an image of effortless, established wealth that matched their own. Vanessa spoke beautifully about love and partnership whenever Kofi was within earshot. Yet Madame Zikora had noticed, in the small, unguarded moments between performances, a coldness in the younger woman's eyes. Whenever she believed no one of consequence was watching, a calculation that reminded the older woman uncomfortably of people she had encountered decades earlier, people who had tried to attach themselves to her own late husband's rising fortune before love had ever entered the equation at all. "I want to know who she truly is," Madame Zikora told Zuri one quiet afternoon, seated across from her in a small tea room adjoining the family's mansion. "Not who she performs for my son, but who she becomes when she believes wealth and power are no longer watching her closely." "And how would you propose to discover that, madam?" Zuri asked carefully, unsure yet why she had been summoned into a conversation that seemed to belong entirely to the family rather than to company business. "By becoming invisible," Madame Zikora said simply. "I intend to disguise myself as a new housemaid in my son's mansion, humble and powerless in appearance, and observe exactly how Vanessa treats someone she believes holds no value to her future. But I cannot manage this alone. I will need someone clever enough to pose, convincingly, as a distant and influential relative of the family, someone whose approval Vanessa will desperately wish to earn, so that the two performances together reveal the complete truth of her character." Zuri sat in stunned silence for a long moment, turning the proposal over carefully in her mind. She had always respected Madame Zikora, admired the sharp, steady intelligence beneath her elegant composure, and she understood, better than most employees at the company, the quiet loneliness that sometimes crossed Kofi's face during long nights of work, a loneliness Zuri suspected had less to do with his schedule and more to do with a growing, unspoken uncertainty about the woman he had chosen to marry. "You believe I could convincingly play the role of someone influential?" Zuri asked, half amused by the improbability of the plan. "I believe you already carry yourself with more genuine dignity than most people born into wealth ever manage to develop," Madame Zikora replied. "The role will require very little acting on your part, only different clothing, and a story I will help you memorize carefully." Kofi, when informed of his mother's elaborate scheme, reacted with the exasperated skepticism of a man who had spent his adult life solving problems through spreadsheets and negotiations rather than disguises and staged deceptions. "Mother, this feels excessive," he said, pacing the length of her private study. "Vanessa loves me. I don't need an elaborate performance to prove what I already know." "Then the performance will cost you nothing but a few uncomfortable weeks," Madame Zikora replied evenly, "and you will emerge from it with your certainty confirmed rather than assumed. But if I am correct, Kofi, and you refuse to look closely enough to see it, you will spend the rest of your life bound to someone who married your bank account, rather than the man attached to it. I am asking for weeks, not years. Surely you can grant your mother that much peace of mind?" Kofi relented eventually, more out of respect for his mother's persistent wisdom than any genuine belief that the test would reveal anything troubling, and within days, the elaborate arrangement was set into motion. Madame Zikora, dressed in the simple uniform of household staff, her silver hair tucked beneath a plain headscarf, her posture deliberately stooped and unassuming, presented herself to the mansion's head housekeeper as a new employee named Mama Adaze, recently arrived from the countryside and grateful for the opportunity to work in such a distinguished household. Zuri, meanwhile, was introduced to Vanessa and the wider family circle as Auntie Fola Said, a wealthy and influential cousin of Madame Zikora's who had spent many years abroad building her own successful business empire and had only recently returned to reconnect with family. A story detailed enough to withstand casual questioning, yet vague enough to avoid any risk of contradiction. Vanessa's reaction to the arrival of Auntie Folasade was immediate and unmistakable, a complete transformation from the woman who had, only days earlier, complained privately to her own sister about the tedious obligations of marrying into old family traditions. She fawned over Zuri from the moment they were introduced, complimenting her jewelry, her posture, her supposed business acumen, positioning herself carefully throughout every conversation as the attentive, gracious future daughter-in-law eager to earn the approval of an influential relative whose opinion she clearly believed might carry weight in shaping her future within the family. "Auntie Folasade, you simply must let me arrange a proper dinner in your honor," Vanessa said during their first meeting, practically glowing with performative warmth. "Family means everything to me, truly. I've always believed that a marriage is a joining of two families, not simply two individuals." Zuri, playing her role with careful restraint, offered only measured, polite responses, watching closely as Vanessa's attention shifted, moments later, toward the humble new housemaid arranging teacups nearby. The warmth vanished from Vanessa's expression instantly, replaced by a sharp, dismissive irritation entirely unconcealed, now that she believed only a servant remained within earshot. "You girl," Vanessa snapped toward Madame Zikora, who kept her eyes lowered obediently. "These cups are arranged incorrectly. Do they not train staff properly in the countryside anymore? Redo this immediately, and try not to embarrass this household with your incompetence while we have such important company visiting." Madame Zikora murmured a quiet apology and rearranged the tea service without protest, her disguise holding steady despite the sting of her future daughter-in-law's casual cruelty, filing the moment away carefully alongside every other small humiliation she would collect throughout the following weeks, evidence assembling itself patiently. one dismissive remark at a time. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated itself with a consistency that left even Zuri, who had anticipated some degree of unpleasantness, quietly astonished at the depth of Vanessa's cruelty, once she believed herself unobserved by anyone whose opinion mattered. She ordered the disguised Madame Zecora to carry heavy trays up and down staircases without ever offering assistance, criticized her constantly over trivial matters that seemed designed less to correct genuine mistakes than to remind the older woman of her supposed inferiority, and once, memorably, accused her of stealing a piece of jewelry that Vanessa herself had simply misplaced during a hurried morning, only grudgingly withdrawing the accusation after the item turned up beneath her own bed later that same afternoon, offering no apology whatsoever for the panic and humiliation the false accusation had caused. The household's head housekeeper, a long-serving woman named Comfort, who had worked for the family for over 15 years, watched these developments with growing unease, quietly confiding to the disguised Madame Zecora one evening that Vanessa's treatment of staff had grown noticeably harsher in the week since her engagement to Kofi had been announced publicly, as though the formal security of the arrangement had removed whatever small restraint she had previously exercised. She used to at least pretend some kindness when Master Kofi's attention was nearby, Comfort admitted quietly, unaware she was confiding in her true employer. Lately, she doesn't bother pretending at all, unless important company is watching. Madame Zecora absorbed this observation carefully, recognizing in Comfort's quiet concern the same pattern she herself had been documenting, evidence gathering not only from her own experience, but from the accumulated testimony of staff who had endured Vanessa's escalating cruelty far longer than the brief weeks of the disguise had required. She began discreetly, encouraging other household staff to share their own experiences. Learning of a driver who had been screamed at for taking a route Vanessa considered too slow despite unavoidable traffic, a gardener dismissed abruptly over a minor pruning disagreement only to be quietly reinstated once Kofi noticed his absence and asked pointed questions, a pattern of casual, consequence-free cruelty that painted a portrait far more damning than any single incident could have revealed on its own. Kofi, watching these interactions unfold gradually over the following weeks, found his earlier skepticism eroding piece by piece, replaced by a growing, uncomfortable awareness he had never allowed himself to fully confront before. He had always known, in some distant, unexamined way, that Vanessa could be sharp with household staff, but he had dismissed it previously as simple impatience, the kind of minor flaw everyone carried in some form, never imagining the sheer scale of contempt she seemed capable of expressing towards someone she believed held no power over her future. He began finding reasons to remain in the house during hours he would normally have spent at the office, positioning himself where he could observe, unnoticed, the small daily interactions between his fiancée and the mother he did not yet realize was hiding in plain sight beneath a housemaid's uniform. It was during one such afternoon that Kofi witnessed an exchange that settled, finally and completely, whatever lingering doubt remained in his mind. The garden that afternoon had been arranged for a small, informal gathering of Vanessa's own friends, an occasion she had used throughout the visit to showcase the mansion's grandeur and her own growing authority within it, directing the household staff with theatrical confidence whenever her friends were within earshot. Madame Zecora, still disguised as Mama Adais, had accidentally spilled a small amount of tea while serving refreshments in the garden, an entirely minor incident that any reasonable employer would have shrugged off without comment, the kind of small accident that occurred in households everywhere without consequence. Vanessa's reaction was immediate and disproportionate, her voice rising into a scolding tirade that drew the attention of several other guests nearby, culminating in a threat to have the housemaid dismissed without pay and without reference, delivered with a casual cruelty that suggested this was far from the first time she had wielded such threats over household staff who displeased her. Vanessa's reaction was immediate and disproportionate, her voice rising into a scolding tirade that drew the attention of several other guests nearby, culminating in a threat to have the housemaid dismissed without pay and without reference, delivered with a casual cruelty that suggested this was far from the first time she had wielded such threats over household staff who displeased her. Several of Vanessa's friends laughed lightly at the outburst, one of them remarking that Vanessa was clearly destined to run an efficient household once the marriage was finalized, a comment Vanessa accepted with visible pride, entirely unaware that her efficiency was being measured, in that very moment, by an audience far more consequential than the friends applauding her from their garden chairs. "Do you understand how replaceable you are?" Vanessa hissed, leaning close enough that only Madame Zikora could hear the full weight of her contempt. "Women like you exist to serve women like me. Remember that, or find yourself back in whatever village produced someone so clumsy." Kofi, standing just beyond the garden's low hedge, felt something cold settle in his chest at the sound of those words, a coldness that had nothing to do with the tea spilled moments earlier and everything to do with the woman he had planned to marry revealing, so casually, so completely, a cruelty he had never once suspected lay so close beneath her polished surface. He said nothing in that moment, unwilling to break his mother's careful disguise before the test had run its full course. But he found himself, later that evening, seeking out conversation with Auntie Folisade. With a frequency that surprised even him, he found Zuri, in her role as the influential relative, remarkably easy to talk to in ways Vanessa had never quite managed to be. Her observations sharp and unpretentious, her questions about his work genuinely curious, rather than strategically probing for information about his finances. She spoke with him one evening about a business decision troubling him, a difficult choice regarding a struggling subsidiary company, and offered an insight so clear and practical that he found himself staring at her afterward with an expression somewhere between admiration and confusion. "You understand business remarkably well. For someone who claims to have spent decades abroad in a field you've been strangely vague about describing," he said, half teasing, half genuinely curious. Zuri felt her pulse quicken slightly at the observation, aware of how close his casual comment had drifted toward the edges of her disguise. "Perhaps I simply pay closer attention than most people expect me to," she said carefully, offering the same evasive warmth she had practiced throughout the deception, though something in the exchange lingered with her long after she retired to the guest quarters that night, an unfamiliar warmth she recognized, with some discomfort, as the early stirring of feelings she had no right to entertain toward a man technically still engaged to someone else. The situation reached its inevitable breaking point 3 weeks into the arrangement. During a formal engagement dinner, Vanessa had organized to celebrate what she believed was her final, triumphant step toward securing the family's fortune permanently. She had spent weeks planning every detail, the imported flowers, the specially commissioned menu, the guest list carefully curated to include the wealthiest and most socially significant families in the city, all of it designed to announce, definitively, her arrival as the future mistress of the household. She had also, unbeknownst to Kofi, spent those same weeks quietly meeting with a lawyer to discuss the terms of a prenuptial agreement she intended to challenge aggressively. Believing that with Auntie Folisade's supposed influence now secured on her side, she held enough leverage within the family to negotiate terms considerably more favorable to her own financial security than Kofi's careful advisors had originally proposed. She had, in fact, mentioned this plan directly to Zuri during one of their private conversations, believing she was confiding in a sympathetic and influential ally. "Honestly, Auntie, these prenuptial agreements are so insulting," Vanessa had said over lunch one afternoon, swirling wine in her glass with practiced elegance. "As though love should come with conditions attached. I'm hoping with your support the family might see reason and simplify things considerably in my favor before the wedding." Zuri had listened carefully, offering only non-committal responses, privately astonished at how openly Vanessa discussed her financial ambitions with someone she had known for barely 2 weeks. revealing through her own careless confidence exactly the kind of calculated self-interest Madame Zikora had suspected from the very beginning. She reported the conversation faithfully to Madame Zikora that same evening, adding one more piece to the growing portrait of a woman whose affection for Kofi seemed inseparable at every turn, from her affection for what marrying him would provide. The night before the engagement dinner, Kofi sat alone in his study for hours, turning over everything he had witnessed in recent weeks. The accumulated cruelty toward his mother's disguised persona, the careless confession of financial ambition Zuri had reported to him through his mother, and the growing, undeniable warmth he felt whenever Auntie Folasade entered a room, a warmth entirely absent from his interactions with the woman he had proposed to only months earlier. He thought of his father, gone now for nearly a decade, who had once told him that wealth had a peculiar way of attracting people skilled at performing love without ever truly feeling it, and that the only reliable test was time, patient and unglamorous, applied consistently to moments when no audience remained to reward good behavior. He understood now, with a clarity that felt both painful and liberating, exactly what his mother's elaborate scheme had been designed to reveal, and he resolved, before the sun rose the next morning, that he would not allow one more day to pass pretending uncertainty he no longer genuinely felt. During the dinner itself, Vanessa's carefully maintained composure began to crack under the combined pressure of hosting duties and the underlying tension she could not quite name but sensed building around her, when Madame Zikora, still disguised as the household's newest maid, accidentally delayed the arrival of a particular dish due to a minor kitchen mishap entirely beyond her control. Vanessa's frustration erupted in front of the entire assembled gathering, her voice sharp and humiliating as she berated the older woman loudly enough for every guest at the table to hear clearly. "This is precisely why I told the household staff that competence should matter more than charity hires," Vanessa snapped, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent dining room. "I don't care where you came from or what hardship brought you here, but you will not embarrass me in front of my guests on the most important night of my engagement." The room fell into an uncomfortable hush, several guests exchanging uneasy glances at the harshness of the outburst, and it was in that charged silence that Kofi finally rose from his seat, his expression calm but unmistakably resolute. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "I think it's time you understood exactly who you've been speaking to for the past 3 weeks." Vanessa turned toward him, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about, Kofi? It's simply a maid who can't manage a dinner service correctly." "That maid," Kofi said, his voice steady and clear enough for every guest to hear, "is my mother, Madame Zikora, matriarch of this family and majority shareholder of the very company whose fortune you've spent the past several months so eagerly attaching yourself to." The color drained instantly from Vanessa's face as Madame Zikora straightened from her stooped posture, removing the plain headscarf with unhurried dignity, her true bearing returning to her all at once, commanding and unmistakable, despite the humble uniform she still wore. A murmur swept through the assembled guests, several of whom recognized, now that her posture and expression had shifted, the unmistakable presence of a woman whose photograph occasionally appeared in the business pages of the city's newspapers, her identity having been obscured until that moment only by their own assumption that a woman of such stature would never be found serving tea in an apron. "I wanted to know," she said calmly, addressing the stunned gathering, "how my son's future wife would treat someone she believed held no power over her life. I received my answer rather more thoroughly than I anticipated." Vanessa's composure shattered entirely, her mouth opening and closing without producing any coherent defense. Panic and calculation warring visibly across her expression as she scrambled to salvage a situation that had collapsed around her in a matter of seconds. "Madame Zikora, This is simply a misunderstanding. Surely you can't believe that a single unfortunate comment reflects... A single comment might reflect a bad day, Madame Zikora interrupted evenly. Weeks of consistent cruelty, threats of dismissal without cause, a false accusation of theft you never once apologized for, reflect character, Vanessa, not circumstance. It was then that Vanessa's attention snapped toward Zuri, still seated at the table in the elegant clothing befitting Auntie Folasade, and a fresh wave of horrified realization crossed her face. "And her?" Vanessa demanded, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. "Who exactly have I been trying to impress this entire time?" "My secretary," Kofi said simply, and something in his tone, warm, despite the tension of the moment, carried an unmistakable note of admiration. A woman whose genuine character required no disguise at all to reveal itself clearly, unlike some people at this table tonight. Zuri rose slowly, no longer needing to maintain the careful performance of Auntie Folasade, and addressed Vanessa directly for the first time without pretense. "I watched you flatter someone you believed could elevate your status," she said, "while tormenting someone you believed could not. That contrast tells this entire family everything they need to know about the marriage you were hoping to secure. The engagement, announced with such elaborate confidence only hours earlier, dissolved entirely before the assembled guests had even finished their appetizers. Vanessa's family, mortified by the public unraveling of her scheme, offered hurried apologies on her behalf as they gathered their belongings and departed the estate in humiliated silence, while Vanessa herself, stripped of the wealthy future she had so carefully engineered, left the mansion that night with nothing but the designer gown she had chosen specifically to announce her triumph. A triumph that had transformed, within a single dinner, into the most public failure of her carefully calculated life. In the weeks that followed, the mansion settled into a quieter, gentler rhythm than it had known throughout the tense months of Vanessa's presence. Madame Zikora resumed her true position within the household without hesitation, though she often joked afterward that the disguise had taught her more about her own staff and about herself than she had learned in decades of simply issuing instructions from a position of comfortable authority. She made a point, in the months that followed, of personally thanking every member of the household staff for their years of quiet service, having gained, through her brief experience as Mama Adese, a far deeper appreciation for the invisible labor that kept her household functioning smoothly. Labor she had perhaps taken too easily for granted before witnessing firsthand how thanklessly it could be treated by someone unworthy of the position she had nearly allowed into her family. She instituted several changes throughout the household in the months that followed, adjusting staff schedules to allow for more reasonable rest periods, establishing a formal channel through which any employee could report mistreatment without fear of retaliation, and increasing wages across the board. Changes she explained simply to her son as overdue corrections rather than acts of unusual generosity. "I spent 3 weeks carrying trays up staircases," she told Kofi with a wry smile during one family dinner, "and I discovered that gratitude is far easier to feel than it is to practice consistently. I intend to practice it properly from now on." Kofi, meanwhile, found himself unable to stop thinking about the woman he had known briefly as Auntie Folasade, a woman whose intelligence and integrity had revealed themselves so clearly under circumstances designed specifically to expose deception rather than character. When his mother finally explained gently that the influential relative he had grown so fond of speaking with each evening was, in truth, his own secretary playing a role devised to protect the family, he felt no anger at the deception, only a quiet, growing certainty about feelings he had been too cautious to examine, while an engagement still stood between them. He found Zuri in the office several days later, sorting through correspondence with her usual quiet efficiency, and he stood in the doorway longer than necessary before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for however many uncomfortable moments that disguise required of you, and an enormous debt of gratitude for however many uncomfortable truths it revealed. "You owe me neither," Zuri said, smiling despite the flutter of nerves the conversation stirred in her. "I agreed to the plan because I believed your mother deserved the truth, and because, I'll admit now, I had grown curious myself about the kind of man you truly were beneath the reputation everyone in this office speaks about so cautiously." "And what did you discover?" Kofi asked, stepping further into the room. "That the reputation undersells you considerably," Zuri said. "You listen more carefully than people give you credit for. You noticed your mother's suffering long before she revealed herself. And you noticed mine as well, though I tried very hard not to let it show." "You didn't hide it as well as you believed," Kofi admitted, a faint smile crossing his face. "There were evenings during those 3 weeks when I found myself looking forward to our conversations more than I was willing to admit, even to myself, while a woman I was supposedly engaged to sat in the very next room." "That troubled you," Zuri said, not quite a question. "It troubled me enormously," Kofi admitted. "I told myself repeatedly that admiring the intelligence of a supposed relative was harmless, that the warmth I felt was simply gratitude for honest conversation in a house otherwise filled with performance. It took my mother's disguise unraveling entirely before I allowed myself to understand what that warmth actually was." Kofi crossed the remaining distance between them slowly, aware that whatever he said next would shift something significant in a relationship that had, until recently, existed entirely within the boundaries of professional courtesy. "I would like the opportunity," he said carefully, "to know you properly now, Zuri, not as Auntie Folasade, not as my secretary managing my calendar, but simply as yourself, without any performance standing between us." Zuri felt a warmth spread through her chest, entirely different from the practiced composure she had maintained throughout the elaborate deception. "I think," she said, "I would like that very much." Their courtship, when it began in earnest over the following months, unfolded with none of the calculated performance Vanessa had brought to every interaction within the family, built instead on the same quiet honesty that had first drawn Kofi's attention during those evening conversations in the garden. Honesty that required no disguise to sustain it, because there had never been anything false about it to begin with. Madame Zikora watched the growing relationship between her son and her former secretary with quiet, unmistakable satisfaction, occasionally remarking to close friends that her elaborate scheme had ultimately revealed 2 truths rather than one, exposing not only the greed hidden beneath Vanessa's polished exterior, but the genuine nobility hidden, until then, beneath Zuri's modest professional title. When Kofi and Zuri eventually married, nearly a year after the disastrous engagement dinner that had ended one relationship and quietly begun another, Madame Zikora insisted on personally overseeing the household staff's preparations for the ceremony, working alongside them, rather than simply issuing instructions from a distance, a habit she never fully abandoned after her brief experience wearing a housemaid's uniform. The wedding itself was held in the same garden where Vanessa had once threatened to have her dismissed without pay, a detail Madame Zikora noted with quiet satisfaction as she watched her son exchange vows with a woman whose kindness toward the household staff arranging the flowers and chairs that day was as genuine and unhurried as it had been throughout every quiet evening conversation that first drew Kofi's attention months earlier. Comfort, the head housekeeper, who had once confided her concerns to a woman she believed was merely a fellow servant, wept openly throughout the ceremony, telling anyone who would listen that she had known, somehow, from the very beginning, that Auntie Folasade carried herself with a warmth too genuine to belong to someone who had learned it purely for performance. Vanessa, whose reputation among the city's wealthiest families never fully recovered from the public exposure of her cruelty, was said to have moved abroad within the year, attempting, unsuccessfully, to rebuild among strangers the same carefully calculated image that had unraveled so completely before people who finally knew better. Word occasionally reached the family, through mutual acquaintances, that she had attempted similar pursuits with other wealthy families in her new city, though rumors of her treatment of household staff seemed, each time, to precede her arrival, an unintended consequence of a story that had traveled far beyond the garden where it first unfolded. Years later, Madame Zecora would often tell the story of her brief life as Mama Adaisy to her grandchildren, Kofi and Zuri's children, gathering them close on quiet evenings to explain why kindness toward everyone, regardless of the power they seemed to hold, mattered more than any lesson taught in the finest schools money could purchase. She kept, tucked away in a small drawer of her private study, the plain headscarf she had worn throughout those 3 revealing weeks. A modest keepsake she occasionally showed to visitors as a reminder of how easily true character could be measured, given the right circumstances and enough patience to observe it honestly. Comfort, the head housekeeper, remained with the family for many more years, often telling new staff members the story of the secretary who became a princess in all but title, and the matriarch who became, however briefly, one of them. Always concluding the tale with the same quiet lesson passed down through the household ever since: that true wealth reveals itself most clearly not in how a person treats those who can reward them, but in how they treat those they believe never can.